We'll kick off. It's a couple of seconds till 6 o'clock. Oh, Raymond has joined us, so that is dead on time.
Brilliant.
Good evening, Raymond.
Well, good evening.
Welcome. Right. I think without any further ado, we're here to talk about, to listen to John Sadler about the Battle of Otterburn, 1388. I know very little about this battle, so without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to John Sadler. Now, let me just... Right. You are now the host, John.
Okay.
Over to you.
Cool. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. On a very wet and windy Saturday in 1988, I was on the field of what we believe to be the field of the Battle of Otterburn, in full armour, I'm happy to say, playing Harry Hotspur. Now, it was a little bit alarming because the majority of troops who were taking part in this 600th reenactment had been supplied by the Ministry of Defence. And this was one company of Scottish junior leaders and one company of English junior leaders. All I can say is, thank God their weapons weren't real. They had wooden weapons. And the Scots were determined to reinforce the fact that they believe they actually won the battle in 1388. It went off very well. It was very exciting. And there were remarkably few injuries in the circumstances. I was also rather closer to today, doing a walk across the battlefield, leading a walk, half the battlefield trust, on the 26th of August this last year, 2021. It was a fairly august company, very select company, fairly well-heeled company, I have to say. We had the Duke of Northumberland, of course, the Percy, and we had the Duke of Buccleuch, the Douglas, and various other luminaries, mainly from the Scottish side, so I had to be careful what I was saying. These two dukes, who are actually first cousins now, had not, Percy and Douglas had not met on the battlefield of Otterburn since the actual fight in August 1388. This time passed off a good deal more cordially, I have to say. Indeed, it was extremely convivial, thanks to the whiskey flask which was being handed around. And the Battle of Otterburn has, over those intervening 6 centuries, exercised a degree of grip on the imagination of locals, and indeed its fame has spread far further, which really outweighs, in many ways, its actual military significance at the time. It was yet another scrap in the very long history of scraps between the English and the Scots along the Anglo-Scottish border between 1296 and 1603, a period which is referred to as the 300 Years' War. Now, this was a very unpleasant period. There was nothing nice, nothing glamorous. It was like Bosnia on steroids. It was a very dark and difficult and vicious time. Warfare had become endemic by 1388. And if we think characters like Hotspur were a bit rough and ready and a bit savage, yes, they were. But they were born and bred in a very savage school. Had they been more gently inclined, then probably they wouldn't have made it out of their teens. It's fair to say Henry Percy didn't actually help the situation. If the border was broken when he arrived, then it was probably more broken by the time he finally left. But he, the Percy, on the English side, along with the Douglas on the Scottish side, were the two, or were representatives of the two leading magnational families on the Anglo-Scottish border. And much of the balladry, which came after, which really was what ensured the fame of this particular fight, is based around the rivalry between Douglas and Percy. Now, this wasn't Montague and Capulet. This is more like Sicilian Mafia. Both had done very well. Both families had done very well indeed out of the Scottish wars, out of the border wars. Without the border wars, neither would have been as rich or as well known or powerful as they were, because one of the conditions which border warfare created was that the local magnates were empowered by their respective crowns to act as agents of the crowns, march wardens as they were called, throughout the whole of the period. This gave them license not only to spend fairly freely out of the public purse, but also to raise their own private armies. Percy and Douglas had powerful personal bodies of retainers, all of whom were experienced professional fighting men. There was indeed, however, bad blood between these two families. Had nothing whatsoever to do with national honour or anything of that nature. It was all about land. Land being something which was a primary occupation, primary fixation of great medieval magnates. After the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, which produced a period of English hegemony, military hegemony, the Percys had been awarded hitherto Scottish lands in the Jed Forest area, just across the border in the Scottish Middle March. These were lucrative estates when they were able to pay rent, but they'd previously been held by the Douglases. And of course, that did not endear the Percys to the Douglas. And much of the sparring that had gone on between these two families, ostensibly involving their roles as march wardens, was actually about who controlled this fairly desirable tract of country. But the war had started much earlier. The war started in 1296. In that year, Edward I of England, Longshanks, invaded Scotland. He did so because his, or as he believed, his vassal, John Balliol, King of Scots, had dared to rebel against him. Edward had selected Balliol from the roll of candidates to become King of Scotland, as he was appointed adjudicator by the Scottish Estates, their parliament, on the death of Alexander III, who died accidentally in 1286. Now, it has to be said that Longshanks was meticulous in his jurisprudence. He had a fair bit of form in terms of arbitrating disputed successions. He was a master of the law. He impaneled a full body of judges. There were 12 judges, and he was actually the 13th or deciding judge. And there were 24 candidates. He allowed them, all the candidates, time to lodge their submissions and indeed to hear representations from their various legal teams. As ever, the lawyers were doing very nicely out of this. Eventually, he decided that John Balliol was the nearest in line to the dead king and that the crown should go to him. In law, this is undoubtedly correct. He was indeed the closest candidate. However, as part of the process, Longshanks had demanded that all of the candidates agree that they would bend their knee to him as King of England. This wasn't new. Kings of Scotland had been bending their knees to the King of England since the days of the House of Wessex, after the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. And this claim had been renewed throughout the early medieval period. William I had made Malcolm III, Malcolm Canmore, Shakespeare's Malcolm, bend his knee in 1072. William the Lion, captured at Alnwick in 1174, had been obliged to bend his knee to Henry II. All of the candidates for the Scottish throne were falling over themselves to agree to these terms, though the Scottish estates refused to ratify them. But Balliol had agreed to become Edward's man, and so he did. Now, anybody less literally minded than Longshanks might have just about got away with it, but Longshanks certainly wasn't best with a great deal of sense of humour, and he was pretty heavy-handed in terms of demanding full feudal service from his vassal, King John of Scotland. Balliol was really between a rock and a hard place. He hadn't necessarily wanted to be King of Scots. His wife made him. We've heard that before. He found the Scots sly, treacherous, and deceitful, which obviously means he'd spent some time there. And he was torn between his allegiance to Edward, to which he'd sworn, but also to Scotland's treaty obligations with France, the Old Alliance, this relationship between France and Scotland. And of course, Longshanks was at odds with the King of France over his own feudal position in France itself, in Aquitaine. Now, Edward demanded that John Balliol do full knight service, as he had to bring an army and fight for Edward against his other ally, the King of France. This was a step too far for the Scottish nobility, who pushed Balliol unwillingly into a rebellion. And that's the key word, rebellion. The English and the Scots embarked on this 3 centuries of war from 2 wholly different perspectives. From Longshanks' view, all he was doing was punishing a disobedient vassal. This was a feudal action. It also meant that anybody who supported Balliol was not entitled to be treated as a prisoner of war. They were a criminal, men who had broken their oath and therefore could expect no mercy, and their lands and their lives would be forfeit. For the Scots, it was, of course, a battle for national liberty, the great cause, a battle for survival against English aggression. And Edward pretty much set the tone in 1296 when he brought his army north and stormed the defences of Berwick upon Tweed, which was then a Scottish city, a leading Scottish port. Now, if you go to Berwick, the city, the town, is encircled by massive Elizabethan walls, the finest fortifications of the Renaissance period in the whole of Britain, which were actually built by Elizabeth I. The medieval walls initially were pretty flimsy. In fact, the Scottish town was defended only by a timber palisade. The Scots rather unwisely hurled insults at Longshanks across the palisade. As I mentioned, he didn't have a particular sense of humour, so he set his horse at the palisade and jumped clear over. This was bad news for the Berwickians because the town was given over to sack. The Scots alleged that some 7,000 citizens of Berwick, men, women, children, were horribly done to death in the course of this. Now, whatever the numbers may be, this was definitely an atrocity, and that pretty much set the tone. For 300 years, English and Scotland killed each other in a fury of hate, without pity, without mercy, and without compunction. Longshanks had won at Berwick, and he destroyed the Scottish army at Dunbar, and then decided it was job done. He put Balliol into not uncomfortable captivity in the Tower, when she released him on parole to his French estates, and abolished the Kingdom of Scotland. He took the Stone of Scone, the famous Stone of Destiny, down to Westminster. It's been a bone of contention ever since. And he appointed a governor, Hugh de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. Scotland was no longer a kingdom, simple as that. However, a group of patriots, particularly William Wallace in the Borders and Andrew Murray of Petty in the northeast, rebelled. Surrey's army, such as it was trashed at Stirling Bridge in 1297. I'm sure anybody who's seen Braveheart, that's a classic Scottish movie, will note that the one thing missing from the battle scene in the Battle of Stirling is the bridge. It's the one thing there is no bridge. Never mind. And Edward was obliged to come north again in 1298 to deal with William Wallace, which he did most effectively at the Battle of Falkirk. Falkirk is interesting because this was really one of the first times in the early medieval period that Edward deployed an all-arms army. He used heavy cavalry, he used longbows, the first time a longbow really features in a major English battle, and he used heavy infantry. The combination proved successful against the Scottish formation, and the Scots preferred or adopted a formation called the schiltrum. The schiltrum is a spear phalanx. The traditional Scottish spear normally had a 12-foot shaft, and the spearmen were trained to move in disciplined bodies. So they could stand to resist cavalry, they could advance against cavalry or against infantry. Properly deployed, the schiltrum was a formidable instrument of war. Its weakness was, as the Scots found at Falkirk, that the spearmen, who generally did not have much in the way of body armour, were horribly exposed to missile fire, to archers. And the English archers, the longbow, the Scots never ever had the longbow, do not possess an equivalent missile weapon. The longbows made pretty short work of Wallace's schiltrums. That was the end of Wallace, really. He was hunted down, eventually executed in 1305. It'll disappoint a lot of his fans to know that firstly, he wasn't actually Australian, and secondly, the real William Wallace was at least a foot taller than Mel Gibson. But he couldn't have hated English any more than Mel Gibson. I think that's probably fair to say. After Wallace's death, Edward imposed a constitutional settlement on Scotland, which the Scottish nobility swore to. As long as Longshanks was alive, he would also always be able to exercise supremacy. But he was getting older, and when his favourite Scottish noble, Robert the Bruce, rebelled against him, he was obliged to come north again. Bruce initially suffered a whole string of defeats, but he won a victory in 1307 when by Buron Sands near Carlisle, the impossible happened to Longshanks. He actually died. Never thought that was going to happen, but he did. He was in his late 60s at that time, which was a big age for somebody in the Middle Ages, and he finally died almost in the saddle. That meant that the mantle of the war the burden of the war passed to his son Edward II. Edward was a completely different man to his father. He was hedonistic, He was not interested in conquering Scotland. He had enough problem with his own nobles. He was pretty much an overt practicing homosexual, which at that time was definitely not at all fashionable. And he never renewed the Scottish War or maintained it with the same degree of energy, giving Bruce time to win an internal civil war against the Baeliars and the Comines and to consolidate his position. Bruce fought a guerrilla war against the English, avoiding pitched battle, avoiding giving them a chance to deploy their superior numbers and indeed their superior firepower with the longbow. It was a very successful campaign. In 1313, with only Stirling still in English hands, Edward II was obliged to rouse himself from his stupor and bring an army north, an army of 20,000 strong, enormous army by medieval standards. But this army blundered into, or not quite a trap, but an impasse at Bannockburn in 22nd, 23rd of June, 1314, and was utterly defeated. That changed the whole dynamic. Bruce now carried the war into England, demanding that Edward recognize him as a free prince of Scotland, carrying fire and sword through the north of England, impoverishing the north of England, even digging up the rabbit warrens in Bamborough to deny sustenance, burning and terrorizing. It was a war of terror, state-sponsored terror, medieval terms, frightfulness, very effective. It had no result though, because Edward really wasn't that bothered by anything that went on north of Watford Gap, but like most governments today, and didn't rise to the challenge. Eventually, of course, Edward himself was deposed by his wife, the She-Wolf, and he was replaced by his young son, Edward III, who, again, was a young man of very different stamp to his father, much more like his grandfather. The thing was, Edward III had bigger fish to fry than the Anglo-Scottish border. Through his mother, he'd inherited a viable claim to the throne of France. That claim was repudiated by the French when his grandfather died. That's the Commission came in favor of the Valois, Philippe de Valois. Edward's claim was disallowed on the basis that he was claiming through the female line, the old Salic law. And on that disagreement hung the whole 100 Years' War. So the war between England and Scotland then spills over into a much wider international war. And as long as the 100 Years' War goes on, the war is three-sided: England, France, and Scotland. Scotland allied to France, not always comfortably, but certainly relying on French aid, and indeed in 1385, actual active French intervention on the borders, which it has to say didn't end well. The problem which confronted Edward III, and which really led in its own way to the Battle of Otterburn and all other battles that followed, was the fact that he had to close the back door from Scotland. He was not tolerate a situation that his father had endured of allowing the Scots free rein across the border. At the same time, he had to be able to marshal his forces and campaign across the Channel, a major amphibious operation. English military operations in the 100 Years' War were, by the standards of the day, immense, huge undertakings with tremendous logistical difficulties. So he couldn't risk having the Scots kicking in the back door whilst he himself was trying to kick in the front door in France. His policy, therefore, was a highly effective one. Actually, basically went back to the policy which the Roman emperors had adopted after the year 367, when it was obvious that Hadrian's Wall could no longer be held. He wanted to create a fortified frontier zone in southern Scotland, a pale, as it's called from Latin, pelan or palisade, to take over and occupy major Scottish garrisons, places like Lochmaben, Fastcastle, and Roxburgh, in order to create a buffer zone between the Scottish state and northern England. Now, he recovered Berwick after a spectacular victory, a longbow victory, at Halden Hill in 1333. Berwick, which had gone reverted to the Scots, was taken back by England. In fact, it changed hands 14 times during the continuance of the border wars, and only finally came to England in 1482, thanks to the efforts of Richard of Gloucester, he of Carpark fame. That wasn't quite enough, though. Edward needed to do more. He needed to have a second line of defense. That second line of defense would be the Northerners themselves. He would empower the Northerners to fight against the Scots. He would empower the Northerners as a local force to fight off the Scottish National Army. Many of the upland dales in Northumberland had been devastated by the Scottish hegemony, and the climatic shift which was occurring in the early part of the 14th century meant the climate became colder and wetter, even colder and wetter than it is today. Whereas previously it had been a more benign climate. That meant that the upland dales couldn't support the level of agriculture. Trying to fight off the Scots meant that many of the local knights, even barons, had gone bust, and their rents simply didn't cover the outlay of defending their estates. So Edward reseeded the upland dales. He introduced a new class of inhabitant, men who held their land not by feudal tenure, but by the sword. And these were named after the horses, the hobbies that they rode, and were called hobblers. And these were a completely different class of warrior. These were not knights in shining armor with massive war horses and flowing pennons. These were warriors for the working day. And these effectively were guerrilla fighters. They rode hard, they struck fast. They wore light armor and equipment. They carried everything they needed in the saddle. They used their lances for prodding cattle, and if attacked, they would dismount and fight as spearmen. The hobblers, which was largely a Scottish creation, was Bruce's invention, were effectively reintroduced or copied in England. And Edward seeded these northern dales with the names which would later become famous as the Border Reivers or Steel Bonnets, the Chartons, Scots, Dodds, dozens of names, all of which, if you look, in spite of all the efforts by both governments eventually to remove them, are still proliferate in the areas in which they were settled. A pretty tough bunch the Borderers became. They had to be. Their big test, first big test, was in 1346. The English had trashed the French at Cressy. The French, in desperation, appealed to the young King of Scotland, Bruce's son, David II, to intervene and launch a diversionary campaign into the north of England, which he did. In the autumn of that year, he invaded with the Scottish National Army, perhaps 20,000 strong, rampaged through the west march of Northumberland, destroyed Hayden Bridge, Haltwhistle, and Hexham, and eventually pitched up outside Durham, demanding, as it happened in the past, that the Bishop of Durham buy him off, pay the Danegeld. However, Edward's forward policy was being tested because the local knights, led by the Nevilles and the Percys, with their retainers, with the help of the exiled Scottish nobles, the disinherited, and Edward Balliol, son of John Balliol, attacked the Scots to their great surprise, and despite a significant numerical inferiority, outside Durham on the 19th of October by Neville's Cross. And in that battle, the Scots were utterly defeated. Again, the longbow did its work. King David II was captured, taken prisoner. Now, having a king killed in battle didn't really matter because there was always somebody else prepared to succeed him. But if he was taken prisoner, that was a bad news because you had to buy him back. He'd have to be ransomed. The cost of his ransom, of course, would be massive. And it effectively paralyzed the Scottish war effort. The next period, up to 1369, then was one of English supremacy. Edward planted the garrisons in the Scottish border. The English borderers fortified their own towers and castles. And the Percys moved in. Now, the Percys were a Yorkshire family. They were Anglo-Normans from Yorkshire, where they held significant estates. They served well, served Edward I well in the early days of the Scottish War, and continued to serve throughout. In 1309, they bought the barony of Alnwick from Bishop Beck, the Prince Bishop of Durham. Now, Beck being the kind of character, Beck was a sort of Arthur Daly of the medieval episcopacy. In modern parts, he was as bent as an eyeball note, and the sale of Alnwick was undoubtedly fraudulent. The Deveskies have been trying to recover it ever since. But the Percys, because they had money, could buy up all these bankrupt manors, all these small manors, which the local knights couldn't afford to defend, were bought at bargain prices. So by the 1380s, the Percys owned most of Northumberland. And with economies of scale, of course, they actually made it work. And they and their relatives and great rivals, the Nevilles, monopolised the offices of border wardens throughout most of the 14th century. And to be fair, the Percys, they owned their money. They held the line. For a while, things went the way of the English until the war with France was resumed. Obviously, the King of France in 1356 was joining King David II as a prisoner in the Tower of London. But in 1369, things began to change. Edward III was getting older. He was beginning to lose his grip. His son, the Black Prince, was already in the grip of a fatal illness, a social disease, as it's believed, leaving a 9-year-old boy, became Richard II, as king. At the same time, the Scots, a new generation of Scots, were sharpening their swords. Principal amongst these, and a big player, major player, for the next 30 years was George Dunbar, the Scottish Earl of Dunbar and March. Now, March was the Bertrand du Guesclin of the Scottish border. He reignited the wars, but carefully. He had read King Robert's testament. His belief was, as King Robert had always said, do not fight the English in open field if it can be avoided. Use asymmetric and guerrilla tactics. Take back your country in bite-sized chunks. And that's what he did. He gobbled up all of the various outlying garrisons, which in the indolent reign of Richard II, who again, like Edward II, had difficulties with his own nobles, his treasury was empty, the French war had actually virtually bankrupted England, and the glory days in France are all long gone. The Scots, therefore, were able to claw back most of what had been lost, which once again exposed England, north of England, to Scottish activity. So really 1370 up to 1402 marks a period of Scottish ascendancy. This was subtle, gradual. Dunbar was careful to orchestrate his war plans in lines with his allies in France. The actual active military cooperation in 1385 proved very unsatisfactory. The Scots and the French really could not actually get on when push came to shove. And the French had no real concept of what war on the Anglo-Scottish border was actually like. It wasn't quite the kind of glorious fields of chivalry that they were used to, very much the opposite. But Dunbar's allies were the Douglases initially, particularly James Douglas, the second Earl. And these were the hawks in the Scottish polity. King was Robert II. Robert II was the first of the Stuart kings. He and his son, who became Robert III, didn't have a particularly good write-up in history. They were regarded as being rather weak kings who were constantly being driven by the war party. Obviously, the war party were after gain, loot, plunder. But they were resisted at every stage by the Percys and the Nevilles, who certainly earned their keep as wardens of the marches. The Scots, organised and orchestrated by Dunbar, were of course able to deploy a national resource. They could raise a Scottish army, and the Scottish army would really normally comprise the armed retainers of the great lords and knights who were taking part, plus a levy of, and the Scots always used conscription rather than contract as a means of raising forces. But again, these forces properly deployed with hobblers like cavalry as their eyes and ears, as their strike force, were highly effective, could be highly effective. And generally the English would find themselves significantly outnumbered. For 1388, therefore, Dunbar had a very ambitious programme. He intended that the Earl of Carrick, who was the younger son of Robert II, the future Robert III, man who would actually rule, who virtually was ruling Scotland anyway, as near regent for his father, would in fact rule Scotland for the best part of 50 years. He would strike with a large force down the west side, attacking Carlisle and moving inland through what is then Cumberland and Westmoreland. The Scots did not generally attempt to lay siege to major fortresses. They didn't have the means, they didn't have the necessary skills to reduce a large fortress, beside which it would take far too long and inevitably relief forces would arrive. The second prong of the attack of this pincer movement would be led by Dunbar himself with Douglas. This would comprise a fast-moving column, a commando, if you like, of 3,000 mounted hobblers, and they would strike down through Northumberland as far as Durham to convince the Percys, with their allies and retainers, that this was the main Scottish invasion. And this hopefully would paralyse or certainly fix the Percys' attention for long enough to prevent them from becoming involved in trying to stop the western arm of the attack, and the defence of Cumberland would therefore be left to the local gentry there. They wouldn't be reinforced from Northumberland. And it worked. The Scots mustered in July a place called Soudenkirk near Jedburgh, perfected their plans, and then swept down through northern England. Now, this wasn't a medieval army in the conventional sense. Scottish hobblers did not have a logistical tail. There were not baggage wagons. There were not glorious tents and pavilions. The men carried all of their provisions in the saddle, and they slept out in the open. It was very, very cost-effective. Warriors for the working day who knew what they were doing, and effectively were professional fighting men led by highly skilled captains like Dunbar and Douglas. From the outset, however, Dunbar was not intending to fight a pitched battle. His was a raid, a diversion. Move fast, strike hard, grab as much loot as you can. Obviously, the profit motive of loot was a big incentive for all concerned, and then get out of it as quick as you possibly can before the Percys can recover from their shock and muster sufficient local forces to constitute a serious threat. And that worked. They swept down through Northumberland, as far as Down, not pausing to loot as they advanced, but gathering the loot as they retired. Now, loot was normally the portable variety, cattle, mainly cattle and sheep, horses, obviously, any livestock that could be transported, and also slaves. The Scots would take slaves and hostages. If you were poor, you became a slave. If you were rich, you became a hostage. You'd be held for ransom by your own family. So this was a harvesting exercise, and human trafficking, if you like, was always a part, for both sides. Human Scots was always part of that. Many households in Scotland had English slaves, and indeed there'll be English households had Scottish slaves. As the army retreated, they passed by the walls of Newcastle. Hotspur was commanding forces in Newcastle. Newcastle, which was a walled town, had been put into a state of defence. Jean Froissart, the Hainault chronicler, who's our main source, primary source, he's a bit more Daily Mail than Daily Telegraph, but he does give us a lot of information, some of which he might not have made up. He records that there was an actual encounter between Douglas and Percy outside the wooden barbican or barrier at Newcastle. The two knights charged at each other, and Douglas made off with Percy's pennon. This was a bit bad form for Percy. It was a bit humiliating that he had lost his pennon. And the story was that the Battle of Otterburn came about because Percy was determined to recover his pennon. That's bollocks. Neither Douglas nor Percy would be too bothered about a pennon, and both were too much seasoned campaigners. Hotspur was 25 at the time, but he'd started his military apprenticeship in France at 9, and he killed his first man at 12. So he knew what he was doing. Percy was given the name Hotspur, not by the English, but by the Scots, because of his speed of response, because of the pace he could move at and strike like lightning in these Scottish raids. What he'd never done was lead an army in battle. Big difference between fighting a quick-moving guerrilla action and committing forces to a significant pitched battle. The Scots withdrew from Newcastle, taking up Ponteland, taking the Castellan of Ponteland hostage. They retreated, not up the current A696, but over the old road through Harwood until they came past Elsdon, and then they reached Otterburn, which is about 10 miles south of the border being pretty much then as it is now, where they laid siege to Otterburn Tower, which is now the Otterburn Towers Hotel. Actually, on the market, it can be also 2.5 million if you fancy. And that was held by the Umfravilles, who again were lords of Reed, still a powerful Marcher family. Percy set off after them. So the battle is fought, depending on which sources you believe, on the 5th of August, which is really the Scottish view, on the 19th of August, the English view. Evidence probably now favours the Scottish view. It was early in August. So, and the battle takes place actually in the evening, the twilight of the 5th. And it's light till about 9 o'clock in Northumberland at that time. And it was a fine day. But Percy had set off that at noon with his whole force to follow the Scots up toward Otterburn. That's a distance of nearly 30 miles, which he covered in 6 hours. Now, of course, medieval armies didn't actually march in the sense of foot slogging. They rode horses. They might fight on foot, but they'd ride their light horses. Even so, that's still quite a feat to drag a force of somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 men up 30 miles of exceedingly bad road to confront an enemy at twilight. So Percy's column passed Elsdon probably at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and would have been approaching Otterburn at around 6 o'clock, about an hour later. About 3 hours of daylight left. There is always a story that the battle was fought in the dark, by moonlight. That is not correct. It was fought in what would be late evening, but still pretty effective daylight for about 3 hours, maybe a bit more on a fine day. Problem was, as Douglas passed Otterburn Castle, he didn't exactly know where the Scots were. That's the problem with a lightning attack. You lack intelligence. You do not know exactly where the enemy is located or whether he's expecting you. Dunbar was not expecting Percy. For once, Dunbar was wrong-footed, but he had prepared for this contingency. He and Douglas had split the Scottish force The commoners, the servants, those of the lower sort, were lower down a ridge of high ground which stands due north, about a mile or so north of the settlement of Otterburn. This runs down from an old Iron Age camp, the Greenchesters, down toward the River Reed. Now, the Reed's changed its course slightly, but not significantly, and the area around, the living area around it, was wet and marshy. On the other hand, of course, all these captured cattle, there'll be hundreds of captured beasts, captured horses, and the Scots' own horses, as they also would also ride, needed water, which of course is an important resource. So the lower Scottish camp held all of the mobile booty and was guarded by effectively light infantry, armed servants, etc. Whereas the higher camp, obviously those the higher the rank, the higher camp, not far from the old Iron Age encampment, that camp contained the Scottish men-at-arms. And exactly which numbers were in each camp is hard to say. It's all largely speculation because Frazar never saw the ground and his accounts don't actually tally. However, from the Scottish main position on the higher ground, there's a very good view down towards Otterburn. You can see the ground pretty plainly. I didn't see any enemy that's advancing across it. What Hotspur did not appreciate, but which Dunbar did appreciate, because he had 3 days of camping there to practice, was that there was a re-entrant which led down from the higher Scottish position, which would be obscured from any force advancing along the valley bottom by a very slight ridge, which had scrub and trees, and it was possible to move men on what would be the north side of the ridge and would to enfilade any force which was coming straight at you. Hotspur hadn't quite got that because he hadn't been able to wrecking the ground thoroughly enough. However, he arrives, therefore, let's say 6 o'clock, with the empty plain before him. Pretty good idea what the Scots are. He knows there's at least one camp by the riverside, and he knows there will be another camp higher up. The Scots will not commit their full force to such a low-lying position. He will appreciate he now has advantage of numbers. He probably outnumbers the Scots by 2 to 1. But if you think about it, if you have a column, if you have a mounted column comprising 7,000 men on medieval roads, they're probably strung out over 10 miles of a lot of ground, even a fast-moving column without logistical tail. A lot of stragglers, a lot of people will drop behind in the dash from Newcastle. So deploying your men fully over that ground at that time is pretty tricky. A lot of Hotspur's force were, of course, archers, longbowmen. And he had 2 choices. He could attack now, but really couldn't deploy his longbowmen because he didn't have a target. Or he could wait till the morning and tempt the Scots out to a pitched battle. However, Hotspur knew if he waited, if he made camp at Otterburn, then Dunbar would use the darkness to withdraw. He'd withdraw north. Scots were very good at this. He would withdraw north into the rough country, extremely wild country, north of Otterburn, leading to the border, and the chances of the English catching them were probably fairly slim. Certainly catching them on ground which favoured the English. Hotspur then decided to divide his forces. Remember the classic dictum, march divided, fight united. Well, a bit like Custer, he did exactly the opposite. He split his force. 2 of his senior officers, Sir Matthew Redmayne and Sir James Ogle, would lead a left flank attack direct toward this lower Scottish camp. So they would march parallel to the river and barrel in a full front, nothing subtle, just smash into the Scottish camp and endeavour, obviously, to destroy that wing of the Scottish army. Hotspur thought that must tempt the Scots, the rest of the army, to come down from wherever they were. So he took command with his brother Ralph of the right-hand column, which would be the stronger, and advanced on a parallel basis, but perhaps a bit more slowly. Redmayne and Ogle, we know, almost certainly went ahead more rapidly, and indeed smashed into the Scottish camp. The Scots had guarded their camp with chevaux de frise, fallen logs, and various obstacles, and a fight developed as the English attempted to break in. Dunbar, appreciating the situation with the camp, sent, I can see from the map here, he sent 200 men-at-arms down from the main camp to reinforce the lower camp and to enable them to hold on, whilst he deployed his men for a flank attack using the dead ground to come upon, as he hoped, Hotspur's men unexpectedly. It's still broad daylight. So the lack of light is not a feature in this. Ogle and Redmayne achieved success. They broke into the camp, and notwithstanding the reinforcement, the Scots in the camp, after a pretty stiff fight, broke and ran, grabbed whatever horses they could, and disappeared in the general direction of Scotland. Redmayne and Ogle, a bit like Rupert's cavalry at Naseby, instead of reforming, they went after them. Obviously, there was a fair bit of loot to be liberated from the camp, but that wing of the English army began to pursue the defeated wing of the Scottish army. And that pursuit continued for 5 miles, almost as far as the border. So although Redmayne and Ogle had achieved success, they had actually thrown that away with their failure to rally their men, leaving Hotspur exposed. Now, on the one hand, Hotspur might have not been too worried because his flank was still protected by the reed. However, at that moment, Dunbar's flank attack, led by Douglas, the Earl Douglas, smashes into Hotspur's column. Exactly what numbers are involved, we don't really know, but they were probably not far off being even. Douglas, we know, in his hurry to get into the fight, leaves his helmet off, which is most unwise for a medieval knight. Indeed, it was about to cost him dear. The English, however, now fighting dismounted, recover from the shock and manage to hold their line. So they managed to hold their line against the Scots, and a fierce fight, an infantry fight, develops on this section of the battlefield, which probably goes on with the usual hots for at least an hour. Now, Dunbar, at that point, realizes that the fight hangs in the balance, and he then deploys his last reserve. He gives his last reserve to Douglas, tells him to outflank the English line and throw everything into that flank attack. Douglas obliges. This second attack begins to fracture the English line. Douglas, with his true berserker spirit, launches himself into the English. He's actually cut down and killed, dies of his wounds, but nobody actually sees him go down in the melee. The melee is now fierce, of course, and will have broken up into knots of fighting men. Bear in mind that the key factor is the English, of course, have been in the saddle or on the march for most of the day. They will be tired long before they got to Otterburn, whereas the Scots are fed, fresh, and rested. In what is now the gloaming, the English line begins to break up. Hotspur and his brother Ralph are captured. Rafe is so badly wounded that the blood is pouring out of the greaves of his armor. And in fact, he's actually released on parole because the Scots don't think he'll survive. Hotspur, fighting bravely as ever, is captured, and the English withdraw. This is not a rout. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of a rout. The surviving English withdraw from the field and march off back towards Elsdon, which is about 3 miles to the south of them. Elsdon being the capital town of Redesdale at that point. And the Scots are left in possession of the field. There doesn't actually seem to be much of a pursuit. Both sides would be utterly exhausted by this point. There is no clear information on casualties. Some say the English lost 1,000, the Scots a few hundred. Others think that the casualties were probably fairly even at around 500 each. Certainly neither side has any appetite to renew the fight. After all, Dunbar hasn't been looking for a fight. To win a pitched battle against the English is really quite a revelation. He's done damn well on this. He's lost Douglas, but he didn't like Douglas anyway. The Dunbars and Douglases do not get on. And therefore, for him, that's a bit of a bonus, really. The English are reinforced the next day by the Bishop of Durham, coming up with a relief force. But the bishop doesn't quite have the nerve to renew the attack. And the Scots, therefore, are left to collect their dead, collect whatever loot they can, and continue their withdrawal. Ogle and Redmayne have reformed their men, and we don't know quite what route they took, but they obviously bypassed the Scottish army. There's no further fight. And both sides then withdraw, and the battle is over, apart from the boundary. The battle is undoubtedly a tactical victory for the Scots. It has a galvanic effect on the course of the war. Richard II and the English nobility are horrified that an English army has actually been defeated in open field by an inferior, in terms of numbers, inferior Scottish force. This, in a way, having said that, it doesn't do the Percys any harm. Hotspur's ransom is 7,000 marks, which is around $500,000 in today's money, which is effectively crowd-funded. And he's released very quickly. Most English prisoners are, the nobles are ransomed pretty soon after the battle is over. And Hotspur suffers no fallout. in the fact that he's been defeated. Now, one of the questions which always dominates archaeological thinking, battlefield archaeology, is where are the dead buried? And all the battlefield archaeologists I know have spent an awful lot of time searching for mass graves, which by and large they never find. Otterburn may be different. Otterburn Church, St. Cuthbert's, is an ancient church. It was founded, as the name would suggest, it was one of the resting places for Cuthbert's coffin when he was travelling south to avoid the attentions of our Scandinavian brethren. In the 19th century, the stone flagged floor of the nave was dug up to facilitate improvements. And beneath were found what was said to be the skeletons of 1,000 or thereabouts young men. Many of those skeletons, it was said, bore evidence of battle damage. Now, of course, there has been no DNA testing, there's no forensic work. The local doctor, who had been a military surgeon, was called to examine the remains and did a pretty comprehensive report insofar as the resources of the time would allow. He concluded that the skeletons were all male, that they were mainly young, between 18 and 45, and that indeed quite a number of them appear to have died violently. They were robust physical specimens. He then had all of these bones reburied in a mass grave just outside the north wall of the nave, where they rest to this day. And there is a major project, an ecological and historical project called Revitalising Restill, funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, run by the Northumberland National Park Authority, which is carrying out significant work on the battlefield. There's been battlefield archaeology, which amazingly enough has found nothing. And there will be a visitor centre built in due course. The battlefield monument erected in the 18th century is getting a makeover. But what we'd really like to do is to get a faculty from the church to excavate the mass grave. I'm sure people will remember the astonishing results from the mass grave at Taunton in the 90s, and also from the mass grave of prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar in Durham, which was opened in 2013. And of course, ancient bones now with modern DNA analysis can tell us an awful lot about the people who were there. We can speculate at the moment that these are the bones of the men who died at Otterburn. St. Cuthbert's was the only consecrated ground at that time. Otterburn didn't have a church. And it would not have been unusual for both sides to agree to a truce to remove their dead from the battlefield. So my money, for what it's worth, is that this is actually a mass grave from medieval warfare, and there are very few of those who have any idea where they might be. Obviously, Taunton was a very lucky find. Big battles, there's been nothing else found at Taunton, even Flodden, which had 10,000 dead. There's been no trace of the mass graves discovered. As an epilogue on the battle, in 1986, I and a small team were summoned by the Ministry of Defence 5 miles north of Otterburn, at a place called Siloans, where actually now is one of the best preserved World War I trench networks in Britain, where the MOD had been clearing the ground, looking obviously for unexploded munitions, and had discovered an anomaly. Their recorders showed something in the ground, but clearly wasn't munitions. So they assumed it was something of archaeological interest, pegged out the site and asked us to investigate, which we did. And we found a sword called the Siloan sword. The sword's not in particularly good condition. It's now in the officers' mess at Reedsdale Camp. There we just had a full-scale replica made, which will be going up in Elsdon Church. And when I looked at the sword, at the fragments, I dated it, its date of manufacture, to around 12, say the last quarter of the 13th century. That's 100 years before Otterburn. Now, I've always speculated, and I can't possibly prove it, that this was booty from the Battle of Otterburn, dropped by the Scots probably in their precipitate retreat, because that's the route that the Scottish camp followers would have adopted had they been heading back to Scotland in a hurry, and that it became lost and was simply forgotten about. Of course, the sword was a high-value item. This was a high-value sword, and of course, swords were handed down from father to son, and it's therefore by no means impossible that a sword that was a century old was still being used by combatants at that particular time. So I like to say that sword is a survivor from the Battle of Otterburn. The Scottish hegemony, therefore, continued until 1400, until the reign of Henry IV, when George Dunbar, the Earl of March, changed sides. He defected from Scotland after a dispute with the new Earl of Douglas and came to serve the English. He advised Hotspur on his next big battle against the Scots, which was Homildon in September 1402. Homildon turned out to be the most perfect ever longbow victory. About 2,000 Scots were killed in the battle, another 500 drowned, 1,000 were taken prisoner, and as far as is known, the English suffered no casualties at all. There would have been some, but certainly there are no recorded casualties. The longbow, punished the dense packed ranks of Scottish lieutenants with such savagery that the Scottish army broke without ever coming to contact. Dunbar then changed sides again. He went to serve Henry IV, because by this time Hotspur had rebelled against Henry IV and met a traitor's death in his third and final battle at Shrewsbury, where King Henry was strongly advised by Dunbar, and Dunbar, along with Prince Hal, has got the credit for winning the Battle of Shrewsbury. I'm going to finish with a question. Shakespeare, of course, made Hotspur famous, Henry IV, Part 1. Anybody tell me which two James Bond actors played Hotspur at Stratford? One in the 60s, one in the 70s. He's the only Shakespeare character I know who's been played by two actors, both of whom played Bond. I'll give you the first one was Sean Connery, and the second one was Timothy Dalton. I'm not sure Hotspur would appreciate that, but nonetheless, them's the facts. So, if anybody would like to ask any questions, ideally easy ones, I'll do my best to give an answer.
If you want to demute yourself, I know.
Right.
I know Maggie's got some questions.
Sure, crack on.
Maggie, you got to demute yourself, and I think you got some questions for
Do
John.
you want me to, because there might be background noise, do you want me to read them out? I didn't quite catch the comment about the Nevilles, or should I say Dunnerville. Were they Nevilles involved in the battle at all, this Otterburn, or in helping with Hotspur's ransom, was the first question. And the second was, any idea when the visitor centre will be available that you mentioned?
Okay, first answer, the Nevilles were related by marriage to the Percys, but actually, and unusually, there was no Neville present at Otterburn. They were related to, but very significant rivals of the Percys. And in the 15th century, that rivalry would actually lead to the Wars of the Roses. It got very nasty in the 15th century. But no, the Nevilles were not involved. I don't know whether they chipped into Hotspur's ransom. If they did, it would have been a few bob and grudgingly. That's all. But the visitor centre, I'll let James know when that's open. I think it's probably not likely to be open to 2023. I think that's most likely. I mean, all the bits are in place. We've got planning permission, which of course takes longer to get planning permission than it does to build Hadrian's Wall. But that's all in place. The cash is there, so it will be going ahead. The designs for all the artifacts and the effects and what have you are all there. So I would think sometime next year it should be ready. But I'll make sure James is kept fully advised of that.
So what you're saying is that quite a lot of what was happening led to the War of the Roses in the end.
Yes. What happened when Hotspur was killed at Shrewsbury as a traitor? 5 years later, his father, the first Earl of Northumberland, died at Bramham-Moor, also a traitor, and their lands were attainted. The Nevilles had been major players on the king's side in suppressing the Percy rebellion and did very well out of it. Hotspur's son, however, was allowed to resume the title, became the second Earl of Northumberland, and spent the whole of his life clawing back much of what had been lost. And that put them on a collision course with the Nevilles, because the Nevilles were not keen to surrender that which they had acquired. And the younger sons of both houses began a kind of sporadic gangster war against each other in the northeast of England, pretty thuggish characters. Hotspur was a bit of a thug. Now, that was fine, except that the Nevilles of the day, Earl of Salisbury, who was the leader of the Northumbrian Nevilles, basically Raby and Durham, his son, Richard Lord Neville, became Earl of Warwick. He married the Warwick heiress, and he became Earl of Warwick, Warwick the Kingmaker. And Neville was also, his brother-in-law was Richard Duke of York. So that inevitably meant that as the battle lines were being drawn in the early 1450s between the supporters of the House of York and House of Lancaster, the Nevilles with Warwick graduated toward Richard Duke of York, which of course gave him a significant power block, because Warwick, through his marriage, was the richest man in England. That inevitably meant that the Percys became closer to Somerset and to the House of Lancaster. In 1453, the Percys set about attacking the Nevilles near York, and that fracas developed into a kind of mini guerrilla-style war between the two families in the northeast of England. That highlighted the weakness of Henry VI's administration. Henry VI, though he appointed commissioners of Oyer and Termine, couldn't actually prevent this mini war from going on. And the other magnational families, the Courtenays, and I think the Cromwells, were at it in the southwest. The Duke of Norfolk was at it with the Paxtons in East Anglia. Royal rule, it was obvious that the king's rule was weak. Richard, Duke of York, however, was his closest relative. And when the king's mental illness became so pronounced in 1454 that it obviously could not continue, Neville was appointed as guardian, effectively as regent, which meant that Somerset got banged up in the tower, and Percy's got a smack across the face, and the Nevilles came into their own. When the king recovered his senses, well, he wasn't that bothered because it looked as though Henry was incapable of fathering a child. But lo and behold, of course, he had a son in that year. A son who, as he grew up, was cruelly said to bear an uncanny resemblance to the Duke of Somerset. Nonetheless, the Lancastrians, who had been alarmed by York's supremacy as Lord Protector, as regent, decided on a final solution to the Yorkist problem, which led to the fight in the streets of St. Albans in April 1455, in which, of course, the second Earl of Northumberland, Lord Clifford, and Somerset himself were all killed. And that kicked off what really was the blood feud that became the Wars of the Roses. So the Percy-Neville feud was a significant catalyst in what then became this major, for 30 years, this major dynastic contest. The good news is the Percys still own most of Northumberland, in spite of that. So they've survived quite nicely over the last 700 years. Very well indeed, in fact. Okay.
Any more questions? Andy? Maggie? What about you, Hugh?
You just said that the Percys have survived. What happened to the Neville family eventually? Obviously, the Kingmaker made a mistake. I don't happen to him, but what after that?
Warwick's luck finally ran out at the field of Barnet in 1471. He pushed his luck a fair bit. He and his brother Montague were both killed. But actually, the Nevilles overall also survived. They're probably the second richest family in the north of England. They had the castle at Raby, and Percy still have their great castle at Alnwick. And the Douglases obviously still own most of southern Scotland. So these great magnational medieval families, if nothing else, have shown an astonishing resilience and held on to the loot.
I mean, did many families who did not get involved in the politics and the wars do well out of it? I mean, were there people who did well out of being rather neutral on these things?
North, if you take Northumberland as a county, Northumberland's really divided into two populations: the rural population, which is dominated by local knights and landowners, and they were already involved because you couldn't have land in Northumberland unless you were ready to fight the Scots, basically. So they were a militarized population who would always be drawn into either the Percy affinity or the Neville affinity. So the knights of the shires were all involved. I think it's hard that there were very few families who were not either largely or peripherally involved. Neutrality wasn't really a choice. In the city of Newcastle, town of Newcastle, it was very different. Newcastle was a major urban centre and was already beginning to get rich on the back of the coal trade. And the merchant guilds of Newcastle, who traded with the Low Countries and with France, were the bankers for all this. So, and of course, bankers are always neutral. They'll rob both sides, with great efficiency. So the urban bourgeoisie, urban elite, they were largely funding these military activities, and they certainly did very well out of it. And they were completely impartial, and they would certainly trade happily with the Scots. There was an awful, in spite of this enmity, there was an awful lot of cross-border trade. There were an awful lot of cross-border marriages. So many of the mercantile gentry of Newcastle and Northumberland were also related to their opposite numbers in Scotland. But Scotland didn't have, really, because Berwick by that time was under control of the English, Scotland didn't have an equivalent to Newcastle. Newcastle actually would become, certainly in the 16th century, one of the richest towns in Europe, mainly on the back of the coal trade.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Didn't know
Sir
that.
John Marley, who was the great hero of the Civil War siege, or the great villain, depending on which side you're on, his income in 1640, before the wars really kicked off, he was making £6,000 a year from coal. He and a group of a mafia, if you like, called the Hostmen, now the town council, ran Newcastle. Now, he was making £6,000 a year. A labourer might make £5 a year. So his 6,000 would now translate into tens of millions. Mega rich. So, and Newcastle merchants were lending money across Europe. Huge trading network, but mainly funded on the back of King Coal.
So Edinburgh or Glasgow were not major centres at all.
Not in the same sense. They were, significant settlements. Glasgow perhaps less so. Even Edinburgh, which obviously seat of the Scottish government, was not anywhere near as rich a trading centre as Newcastle. Newcastle was on a par with Paris and Milan in terms of its mercantile significance.
Really?
Extraordinarily rich.
Okay, interesting. But I mean, whereas, dare I say, Paris and Milan have left lots of artwork and one thing another. Now, I know you come from that area, John.
Oh,
so
you see, we're not civilized, like, right?
Yay!
Right, we've got Gaza. We've got Cheryl.
Jimmy
Cheryl
Five
Cole.
Bellies.
Shearer. We've got Shearer. Aye, Jimmy Gardner, Five Bellies. There's a lot of cultural figures in Newcastle, really. Perhaps our overall cultural impression footprint isn't as great as Paris or Milan's. But we've got the Metro Centre, we've got some lovely pubs and clubs and stuff, and got St James's Park, obviously. Well, I don't know if the teams ever won a match in living memory, but we still have the football now. So it's probably fair to say Newcastle, obviously in the 19th century, became again one of the great, the coal fund initially had funded, but then heavy engineering became the trademark at the time. Lord Armstrong, the great arms manufacturer, he was employing 66,000 people in the 1890s in his factory at Elsie. Yes, that was a massive population. Newcastle did. What happened was that those who made their money in Newcastle, well, they didn't live there. They bought up the country estates. All the large castles in the Thumb and estates were bought up by mercantile gentry, people like Armstrong, who ended up owning Bamburgh Castle. And Armstrong was, he was no better than he ought to be, really. But he created a whole line of his imaginary ancestors in portraits and aped the gentry, collected everything. So a lot of the wealth of Newcastle then spread out into the Shire. And in a way, the mercantile elite became the new aristocracy in the 19th century. The Percys were still doing very well because they had a lot of coal mines, but the industrial renaissance of Newcastle funded this a lot of wealth trickling out into the countryside. But then, of course, really after the First World War, industry declined, and to that extent, Newcastle never ever recovered its economic dominance. It's got nightclubs and stuff now.
Yeah, oh, it's a great place.
Has its moments, yeah. Cool. Are we all done?
Any more questions? Andy? No? Hugh? Maggie?
I was going to say, showing my age about Newcastle, but the Dire Straits and Chris Rea, didn't they come from Newcastle? So some good music.
Mark Knopfler. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No, my cousin was a guitarist with Dire Straits, and Chris Rea, Chris Rea's from Middlesbrough. We don't really talk to people from Middlesbrough because they're a bit, they're just not quite like us. But yes, you got Dire Straits. The Animals, and I'll show my age. The Animals, of course, came from Newcastle. So and Sting, obviously, God's Only. Sting is a Novo Castrian, and Cheryl, fine musical tradition, continuing. And if you don't like National Break, you're on. So there you are.
Lindisfarne.
Yeah, Lindisfarne. Yeah. Fog in the Time, all mine.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, John, thank you very much. I certainly learnt a lot from that. It's not a battle I know. It was great to hear about how it was, how it all tied up with the War of the Roses. Obviously, we're doing a War of the Roses tour later on this year.
Excellent.
And it was good to sort of put that in perspective, certainly for myself. So Thank you very much.
My
Ladies
pleasure.
and gentlemen,
Enjoyed it.
thank you very much for tuning
Yeah.
in. Next week, no, not next week, 2 weeks' time, we've got the Siege of Detroit in 1812. And that's done by
Excellent.
Lieutenant General Jonathan Riley. Again, a battle I never know about. It involved Indians, local native Indians. So, you know, do tune in if you wish to. It would be great
Sure.
to see you all. Well,
Lovely.
take
Thanks
care.
very much. See you
Have a
guys.
great
Cheerio.
weekend, and hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time. Bye.
Bye.